All knowledge is conjectural. It could possibly be false. We, after all, are fallible human beings, flawed and prone to error. Moreover, the laws of physics mandate that we cannot possibly have knowledge of all possible factors that might come to bear on any situation. Now, this is a consequence of quantum theory. And also, things decay, a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics. So our knowledge is necessarily incomplete and subject to errors creeping in over time. So the laws of physics themselves constrain what it is possible to know and how. There's no royal road to truth. Knowledge is hard won. And the method by which it is won is by a critical method. Our guesses about reality are tested out there in the physical world, subject to scrutiny and experiment, argument and a collision with natural phenomena. Our buildings instantiate our knowledge of engineering. And when the earth moves in an earthquake, our theories of construction are put through trials. If the building collapses in a way unforeseen, we learn something, and we learn it the hard way. Now, knowledge is objective in two senses. First, in the ontological sense. The objects out there have a real existence. They are separate from us and not mere products of our mind. Stars would continue to shine and birds tweet even if no people had ever evolved anywhere in the universe to observe any of it. Knowledge is out there in objects. In the DNA of a bird, knowledge exists to build a bird. In our built environment, we instantiate our knowledge of how matter can be shaped and controlled to bend to our will. So we take silicon and craft it into lenses, and metal and form it into cylinders, and we place the lenses at just the right distance from each other, and we build a telescope. We instantiate the knowledge, literally the laws of physics, the laws of optics, as well as some chemistry, into the physical world, into the telescope. The knowledge is out there in the world, not merely in our own minds. Were all the people who ever learned to build telescopes suddenly lost to us, but not the telescopes, all the knowledge of how to build a telescope would not be lost. An interested child coming across such a device, this metal cylinder with a few bits of shaped glass and perhaps some mirrors inside, could find that it could bring into focus distant objects when correctly aligned and fiddled with a bit. And with more investigation, determine that the lenses have special shapes and are a careful distance apart from each other, and that the cylinder itself serves a special purpose, and so on. In other words, almost all the knowledge to build a telescope is right there in the telescope. Now, I'm going to be reading in part today from this book, Objective Knowledge, by Karl Popper, An Evolutionary Approach. And the reason I'm doing this is there's been a few interesting internet phenomena that have been going on lately, and I think it's probably useful to analyse those in light of what Popper has said. Now, returning to my telescope, sure, there's going to be matters of geology if the child wanted to start from absolute scratch and gather the silicon and metal from their ores, and perhaps there is some inexplicit knowledge as well in the building of the telescope that might make things easier. But in truth, in principle and in practice, anyone who's really curious and who came across a telescope could learn to build a telescope, even if there was no one else alive who knew or was interested in doing so. And this is ignoring that anyone so interested would have access to libraries and the internet and all the resources ever accumulate on telescope building. So this laboured point is just to say knowledge is out there in objects. It is objective in that sense. Subjectivity exists, that is, our experience of the world, a synonym for that poorly understood concept of consciousness. But knowledge, insofar as it is there at all, is not of the same type. We shall come to that momentarily. So I think I've laboured that point enough. I'm just saying that knowledge is out there in objects. It is objective in that sense. Now, our personal subjectivity, of course, exists. We have an experience of the world. Our experience of the world, or our subjectivity, that's just a synonym for that poorly understood concept that we call consciousness. And so subjective knowledge, insofar as it exists at all, is not of the same type as objective knowledge, and we'll come to that momentarily. But there's another sense in which knowledge is objective. Knowledge is tested by a critical method. When someone makes a claim, there are tests, there are criticisms, there are criteria against which we judge the knowledge claim. The test can be more or less rigorous, but valid critical tests are not mere matters of opinion, but rather encounters with reality and other knowledge already out there. So a scientist who claims that they have determined a way, let's say, for humans to travel through space beyond the speed of light, well, we can test this claim. Indeed, we can try to build their device or implement their theory and therefore try and refute the claim that way. We often don't need to do this, however. But if the test did show the claim to be false, well, so much for the claim. Often what we do is we just put that claim alongside the best alternative, which for now is Einstein's theory of special relativity. Now, we could use the general theory, but I don't think we need to get more complicated than necessary. Now, that theory, the special theory, explains what happens as your speed increases to near the speed of light. It actually is applicable for all speeds, but the phenomena that are unusual are most obvious when you get to the higher speeds. When you do start to get near to the speed of light, time outside of the moving frame slows down with respect to time for the person who is moving. So you're zipping along near the speed of light and you look outside of the frame in which you are. If it happened to be a rocket ship, you just look outside the rocket ship, and you would notice that all the processes going on outside the rocket ship, the ticking of clocks, the aging of people and so on, are happening at a rate slower than what is going on inside the rocket. Everything seems normal inside the rocket. Everything outside the rocket seems to have slowed down. So time outside of the moving frame slows down with respect to time for the person who is moving. An object moving at the speed of light, like light itself, actually gets places in zero time. Time outside the frame of a photon of light stops. So going faster than this would mean going back in time, and that raises all sorts of problems. And those problems that are raised will not be solved by this new claim that you can move faster than the speed of light. And so on that basis, we can refute the faster than light theory. Moreover, moving a mass like a person to the speed of light requires an infinite amount of energy. So that's another criticism of the new claim. So the claim is going to fail any test. It's going to be unable to answer questions about what happens to time and energy, and it is simply going to fare as an exceedingly poor rival to what already exists, the explanatory theory that is the special theory of relativity. So its encounter with the world has caused it to be refuted by an objective set of criteria. It has failed to do what it purported to, and this is no one individual's mere opinion. It is a fact about what has happened in reality with that new claim. This is objectivity in the epistemological sense. It's not a matter of opinion or bias. That would be subjective in the epistemological sense. And who desires knowledge in that sense? Who wants knowledge to just be about opinion and bias? So much for the misconception of subjective knowledge. But this doesn't entirely rule out subjective knowledge. But we need to be cautious because subjectivity exists. Your consciousness exists. We have a mind, we've got an internal life, a consciousness. Our thoughts and expectations are confined solely to our own minds. So they are, in a sense, a kind of subjective knowledge. But what is its nature? Popper wrote on this. And so let me make a few remarks and a few quotations, and provide a few quotations. Subjective knowledge we'll come to see is knowledge that exists solely within a single organism in some way. Suffice it to say, for now, it's not knowledge of a conscious sort, Popper will explain, but rather an unconscious kind. So, for example, the knowledge that's in DNA. We will see that conscious subjective knowledge does not exist. But it is also important to dwell upon the idea that subjective knowledge of the kind expounded by many philosophers is simply a mistake handed down from Plato, and in many ways uncritically consumed by generations of teachers, academics, scientists, and other thinkers. Plato was the one who demanded that knowledge count only as knowledge when it was justified true belief, or JTB. Now, elsewhere, I do deal with why knowledge cannot be justified, why we should not expect it to be true, and why it cannot be about belief. So you can go to my blog post on Seeking Truth, where I attempt to criticise all three parts of that the Platonic ideal of knowledge being justified. It's not justified. True, it's not true. And it's not about belief either. But let's, for now, just concentrate on the belief part and explore this notion a little bit more deeply, a little bit more broadly. Belief, if it is anything, is something that people can have or conscious creatures might have, but books and telescopes do not. As we've already seen, objects out there in the real world, from DNA to books to buildings and telescopes, instantiate knowledge. DNA instantiates the knowledge of how to build an organism. The DNA doesn't have beliefs. So at the bare minimum, the knowledge there has absolutely nothing whatever to do with belief. So we've already ruled out this J2B conception of knowledge. But what about belief in people? Now, Popper is the most underrated philosopher of the 20th century, although in recent years with the rise of some critical rationalist groups on the internet, which I think is a wonderful surge, we've seen a wonderful surge in interest. More positive remarks have been made about Popper, but he's still dismissed as something like, that guy who said that science was about falsification and not confirmation. And that amounted to the very smallest portion of what his overall philosophy was about. A crucial part, a necessary part, but that is certainly not sufficient to provide a good understanding of what his entire worldview was about. He did remarkably more than just falsification. So let us turn now to some of his remarks on belief and subjective knowledge, and I'll make comments where I think they might be useful. These quotes are, as I've already said, from this book, Objective Knowledge, an Evolutionary Approach. This is the 1983 edition. Quote, "What we have to do is start from the fact that objective scientific knowledge is conjectural, and then look for its analogue in the field of subjective knowledge. This analogue can be easily identified. It is my thesis that subjective knowledge is part of a highly complex and intricate, in a healthy organism, astonishingly accurate apparatus of adjustment, and that it works, in the main, like objective knowledge, by the method of trial and elimination of error, or by conjecture, refutation, and self-correction, autocorrection." This is on page 77. Later, quote, "I used to take pride in the fact that I am not a belief philosopher. I am primarily interested in ideas, in theories, and I find it comparatively unimportant whether or not anyone believes them. And I suspect the interest of philosophers in belief arises from that mistaken philosophy which I call inductivism. There are theorists of knowledge, and starting from the subjective experiences, they fail to distinguish between objective and subjective knowledge. This leads them to believe in belief, as the genesis of which knowledge is a species." So Popper then goes on to say that this species from which the knowledge can be derived is something like justification or a criterion of truth, such as clarity or distinctness or vivacity or sufficient reason. That's what provides the difference between knowledge and belief. That's what Popper says. And then quote from Popper, "This is why, like E.M. Foster, I do not believe in belief." End quote. Popper then goes on to explain how there are other reasons for being sceptical of belief. He admits there are psychological states that might be called expectations, and there are shades of these where we might expect things in some bright sense. So, for example, you might have looked at the timetable and the bus is due to arrive at 3:22 and it's 3:21 right now, and you've checked your phone, and on the phone you can see the bus is about to come as well. So you expect that at 3:22 there will be the bus in front of you. And so that's a very bright sense in which you really do have this expectation. And then there's this other sense, this sort of more dim sense, that perhaps you'll get sick at some point before you die. You'll get some serious illness. So in some sense, you don't really want it to happen, and you're not really believing it. But there's this expectation that this is what happens to people before they die. They tend to get sick at some point. So you have this grey scale of expectations, all the way from you expect it strongly in some sense through to you kind of know it will happen, but it's sort of a distant, dim phenomena, mental phenomena. So some things are immediate and press on the mind strongly, and some less so. Popper says these things do not amount to beliefs, but will be taken seriously by someone who takes induction seriously. And of course he does not. On page 71, Popper then fleshes out his thoughts on subjective knowledge some more. Here he speaks about how subjective knowledge is a dispositional and expectational thing, and that this knowledge, which exists in the genes of an organism, is in large measure inborn. So this is a refutation of the blank slate people. Much has been made of Steven Pinker speaking recently, or writing books indeed, about a retort to the blank slaters. Popper was there decades ago. Quote from Popper: "All acquired knowledge, all learning, consists of the modification, possibly the rejection, of some form of knowledge or disposition which was there previously, and, in the last instance, consists of inborn dispositions." Popper then goes on to say, quote, "From the point of view here reached, we must reject as completely baseless any subjectivist epistemology which proposes to choose as a starting point what appears to it quite unproblematic, that is, our direct or immediate observational experiences. They are not absolutely reliable." Here, let us leave Popper for a moment and come to the present day, which I'm speaking on May the 18th, 2018. The internet has been abuzz in recent days with a number of auditory hallucinations. I'm going to provide here my favourite, let you watch the clip. You should watch it at least 4 times. I'll just play it once for you. So you need to rewind this video, clearly, or go and find it on YouTube. When you listen to the following audio, you need to listen out for 4 permutations of the following set of words. The first time you listen out for the word brainstorm. Then listen out for the word green needle. Then listen for brain needle. And finally listen for green storm. Now, almost everyone I've tested this on, I've tested it on scores of people at this point, seems to be able to hear all 4 permutations with more or less effort. Now, what's this suggest? Well, it shows our observations are theory-laden, to use Popper's jargon, or to return to our present analysis, we have some expectations. These expectations are at root something to do with inborn ideas, a genetic wiring that causes our hearing to be sensitive to particular frequencies. We modified those as we learned language. They're now deeply ingrained, and so in context, as an English speaker, we could be primed to hear certain things. We have expectations, theories, and those theories affect what is observed. The real world is out there for us to test, but the meaning we find is shaped by our interpretations of it. Let me return now to Popper on page 72, where he has just said we can reject this idea that we must begin our creation of knowledge with our direct and immediate observational experiences, because they are not absolutely reliable, as we have just seen. After all, what did you hear in that audio? What you heard depends entirely upon the theory operating in your mind at any given moment. You may even hear something else entirely if you try. Popper says on page 73 now, quote, "Our observations are highly complex and not always reliable, though astonishingly excellent decodings of the signals that reach us from the environment. They must not therefore be elevated to a starting point in the sense of a standard of truth. Thus what appeared as an apparently presupposition-free subjectivist epistemology or tabula rasa theory disintegrates completely. In its place, we have to erect a theory of knowledge in which the knowing subject, the observer, plays an important but only a very restricted role." End quote. Now, his next section in the book is chapter 3, and it's called Knowledge in the Objective Sense. And I'll quote again. "The common sense theory of knowledge, and with it all, or almost all, philosophers until at least Bolzano and Frege took it for granted that there was only one kind of knowledge possessed by some knowing subject. I will call this kind of knowledge subjective knowledge, in spite of the fact that, as we shall see, genuine or unadulterated or purely subjective conscious knowledge simply does not exist. Subjective knowledge in the unconscious sense," end quote, by the way, end quote. "Subjective knowledge in the unconscious sense consists of the dispositions of an organism. So, for example, when you hear brainstorm earlier on, your sensation of this is subjective. It can't be shared. But you know you heard it, right? And yet you can also be mistaken about what you heard, because a moment later, and you hear the same thing, but it's green needle. So you can be mistaken about your own qualia. There's an unconscious dimension to this. Consciously, you can tell yourself, okay, listen for brainstorm, and you'll hear brainstorm. You consciously tell your unconscious to do your bidding in this way. Objective knowledge is out there in the real world. Objective knowledge is published in books and instantiated in objects like cars and technology. It is the kind of thing that can be transmitted. But your personal knowledge of the brainstorm thing, not quite. It's what's called qualia, the subjective character of different perceptions. Beginning on page 106, Popper has a chapter titled Epistemology Without a Knowing Subject. Here, Popper defends a conception of reality where, 1, we can consider the existence of objects out there in the physical world. 2, we can consider our own mental states. And finally, 3, we can consider objective knowledge, which I would say are the explanations published in books and so on that articulate the connection between things. Now this world 3, as it's sometimes called, but I won't refer it to the worlds, but this third kind of structure, knowledge, objective knowledge, is the domain not only of science, but also mathematics and art and poetry. It is things apart from just our conscious experience of them. Things that have an existence, but they are more than the mere matter in which they appear. So a poem isn't just marks of ink on a paper, or light and pixels on a computer screen, or sound waves in the air when someone recites the poem, or movement of electrons in a wire when someone amplifies, transmits and records it. The poem has an existence that is simply not reducible to its physical instantiation in any particular copy. But the poem itself is identical, no matter what the instantiation is, error aside. So knowledge really is about this third kind of thing and not about the second kind of thing, the mental objects thing. So you've got physical objects out there in the real world, mental objects inside of your mind. But the third kind of thing, knowledge, which is the relationship between those things out there in the real world, it doesn't have much to do with number 2. It doesn't have much to do with mental events going on inside of your mind. Mental states, experiences, consciousness, they're real, just as real as 1, the physical world, but in a very analogous way in which knowledge cannot be found in the physical world as nothing but atoms and particles or vibrations. It instead has an abstract nature. It's a pattern in those things, but not reducible to forces, laws of motion in physics or motion of particles. It cannot be found solely in mental experience either. In short, it is neither pure matter or pure mental. And indeed, looking in either of those places exclusively and attempting to reduce knowledge to the mental or to the material is a mistake. In both cases, physical objects and mental experiences, we find crucial components for the creation, representation and use of knowledge. The physical objects form the media upon which we record our knowledge. And also, it is the raw materials in which we instantiate our knowledge. The city grows from the rocks and forests and resources that we gather together, but it only happens in the presence of the right knowledge. And the mental world of our experience, the consciousness of people, is where the knowledge is experienced and used to solve problems, both your personal problems and problems broadly. Now, somebody asked me recently, why is subjectivity considered a risk to knowledge? What assumptions underlie that claim? Well, and also they asked, how and in what ways does subjectivity impact knowledge acquisition, and name some areas of knowledge where this is relevant. Okay, so here's my answer to that. Subjectivity isn't a risk to knowledge. Knowledge, after all, is objective, so it's kind of impervious to what's going on inside of someone's personal subjectivity. But the claim, or rather the demand that knowledge be considered as subjective, is dangerous because it leads to relativism. In the epistemological sense, subjective knowledge is just your opinion. So if knowledge is like that, then our attempts to converge upon the truth will fail. We'll all just be going our own way and with no criteria for making progress. and sorting what is true from what is false, what is good from what is evil, what is beautiful from what is ugly, and so on. There is a harmless way in which there is a species of knowledge which is subjective. All organisms have their own individual DNA. So your DNA is different to mine and everyone else's on the planet, and all of ours is different to a cat's, and that's different to what a fish has. This genetic knowledge provides us with our experience of the world. For example, I can look outside right now and I can see a clear blue sky. And the colour that I see depends upon the concentration operation of cells called cones and rods in the retina of my eye. This concentration of cones that I have determines the vibrancy of the colour that I might see. I might, for example, have 6,234,454 cones, and that has been predetermined by the DNA, the genes that are inside the nucleus of each of my cells. Now, you might have not 6,234,454 cones, you might have 6,984,566 cones. And in both cases, it's to do with our DNA. This is what we are born with. In large part, it's to do with our DNA. Modulo mutations that happen throughout the course of our life or whatever. So, you know you see a certain colour blue when you see the sky. But mine might be ever so slightly different because the cells that are sensitive to colour, well, we've got a different number of them, a different concentration of them. Maybe they are arranged in the retina slightly differently. All of this gives our perception, a visual perception of the world, a slightly different character. Hence also the way in which we hear that brainstorm green needle thing. Our ears will also be different because the number of cilia, the little sensitive hair cells that are inside the cochlea of our ears, they might be slightly different. So Popper dealt with how subjectivity impacts knowledge acquisition. He said all acquired knowledge, all learning consists of the modification, possibly the rejection, of some form of knowledge or disposition, which was there previously, and in the last instance of our inborn dispositions. End quote. So we start with some inborn ideas, and then we adapt these over time as we learn more and more. That this happens in our conscious mind is the subjective component, but of course, the actual learning is an encounter with the real world. The physical world kicks back, and our ideas are sometimes refuted, and by that means we learn. But that encounter with the real physical world of objects out there is an objective process. It's not your mere opinion that it turned out that when you were making toast this morning and thought you'd leave it on for 5 minutes, that when it came out black and burned and charred, well, that's not your mere opinion. You learn that 5 minutes is too long to leave bread on to toast. Acquisition, learning of this kind, is subtly different to that which goes on in, let's say, science. Although acquisition begins in a mind subjectively, of course, and so science, in a sense, begins in the mind of the scientist with a creative conjecture, but then it's subject to robust criticism from other people and from the world. And then it's no longer a matter of personal, subjective experience. It is objective. And it is only objective knowledge, through its encounters with the real world, the kicking back from things outside of our mind, that our knowledge can improve. I cannot improve my knowledge of the colour of the sky by simply staring more and more at it and reflecting and introspecting. That subjective experience is just a part of me. My subjective state of mind isn't something that I have control of in that sense. I can be mistaken about my subjectivity, of course, but it is within. If I want to improve it, I'll need to communicate with others and try to refute my idea. But for now, qualia, sensations of blue, for example, cannot be communicated between people. But this is no great obstacle for most of the questions that occupy us for now. David Deutsch, following Karl Popper, has emphasised how objective knowledge is what allows progress, and progress that is unbounded. This growth of knowledge has nothing to do with belief, thinking that something is actually true, or somehow guessing that something is likely to be the case. No, none of that is required. Knowledge always remains provisional, even though it is objective. Indeed, because it is objective, it can always be subject to error and correction, and thus able to be improved. Popper and Deutsch really have given us an optimistic vision of how knowledge grows. We should take their ideas seriously.